Dracula Chapter 13. Again, the assumption is that you've read the chapter, and we can therefore just go through it and highlight specific aspects within it. So, quick review. Dr. Seward and Arthur notice how Lucy seems more alive in death. Jonathan Harker sees a young Dracula in London. Van Helsing gets the giggles at Lucy's funeral, and children in Hampstead are found with strange neck wounds. Okay, so once more we realize that Seward is taking control of the narration, and in chapter 13 we start with his diary. Arthur is attending his own father's funeral, so it is left to Dr. Seward to make the arrangements for Lucy's funeral. And note that the funeral was arranged for the next succeeding day. So a reminder that Lucy dies on the 20th, and in great haste and great speed, the funeral is arranged for the 21st. So it's important to remember that in the Victorian era, elaborate, luxurious funerals were just very popular. Okay, people were very fascinated with death, and they went to great lengths to not necessarily celebrate death, but allow for mourning on the behalf of those who left behind. Probably coming from the idea of Queen Victoria, who herself mourned her husband's death for her entire life. And if you recall, she wore black from the day that he died. So what we've got here is a twofold situation. The characters most in love with Lucy, so we've got obviously our three gentlemen plus Van Helsing, have the opportunity to grieve for her now that she's dead. And Stoker then also uses minor characters like the chap working in the funeral parlour, the Undertaker's assistant, to punctuate their emotional distress. And he does this by punctuating the upset with some mundane and some rather detached observations. So I think it's quite interesting to note that the professionals who deal with death, that attend to the death, that deal not only with the funeral but also the paperwork, etc., kind of added this jarring, cynical humour to the scene. The fact that the solicitor seems to get personal pleasure at the legal tidiness of the deaths in the matter of inheritance, or the fact that everything's organised and it's really not a difficult case at all, makes him seem foolish and insensitive. And Seward actually remarks on the limitations of sympathetic understanding. Also, we've got the Undertaker's assistant, who talks about Lucy being beautiful, and it's kind of macabre blend of a professional pride and business acumen, and again highlights that Lucy is looking amazing. So when this Undertaker's assistant comments, it's obviously he's been preparing the body for burial. So just remember that. And of course, preparing the body for burial often meant putting makeup and things on. So the idea is that she's so beautiful, she doesn't need any additional work. So the appeal of her beauty seems to increase and has increased exponentially since she has died, and those who really love her and knew her find this very disturbing. And it's the first kind of significant sign that Lucy is going to inherit, or has inherited, life after death from her vampire lover. So if we look again, the Undertaker's assistant says she makes a very beautiful corpse, so it's quite a privilege to attend on her. She's not too much to say that she will do credit to our establishment. So the comment is made by the assistant Undertaker and is reflective again of his business acumen and his pride in his work, but it also seems to mirror what Seward's thinking. Seward not necessarily thinking about their business, but the fact that she is a very beautiful corpse. Goes on to talk about how Van Helsing is ever discreet. He takes over all of Lucy's documentation. It's because he says that he doesn't want strangers to read it, and perhaps especially her journals, and perhaps find out what's going on. Again, remember, he is all about discretion and making sure nobody reads this that shouldn't. And again, of course, the irony is that we are all strangers. The person reading the text, the reader, is strangers, and it has been created for us. So there is some irony there. And we again get the picture of Van Helsing as an unbelievably well-rounded man, the savant, the genius, because as he says, you forget that I'm a lawyer as well as a doctor. So he is not just a doctor here, he's clearly very well read and studied. Okay, so they sort everything out, and he says, and now, train John, I think we may go to bed. So it's only after taking care of everything that Seward feels that he and Seward can take that Van Helsing feels that he and Seward can take a rest. I think it's quite frightening that Lucy is so beautiful, because and they are surprised at how lifelike she looks, and all her loveliness had come back to her in death. So remember, she had been rather ill before her life ended, and she'd been ravaged by the illness, and she looked very gaunt. And again, it's only in death that her beauty is restored. So they're all very surprised at how lifelike she looks. And again, we note that Van Helsing puts garlic flowers on the bed on which she's lying, and also places a gold crucifix in her mouth. He then turns to Seward and says, I want to cut off her head and take out her heart. And then he says, are you a surgeon? And so shocked. And of course, Seward's response is, but why do it at all? So clearly, Dr. Seward is very, very shocked. His reaction to Van Helsing's idea that they mutilate the corpse, however, is quite restrained, surprisingly. He says, why do it at all? He doesn't protest. No, no, no. Now remember the fact that he loved her and he wanted to marry her. So you would think he'd be more vehemently opposed to Van Helsing wanting to cut off her head and take out her heart. But he's not. So the implication is he realizes that there is something amiss, and that he's now got to bow to Van Helsing's superior knowledge. And remember that he does trust Van Helsing. And this is clear because he doesn't require any elaboration. He doesn't question Van Helsing's motivation. So these two become conspirators, and they're almost operating behind Arthur's back, because I can't tell him this, because Arthur will be devastated. And Van Helsing, if you notice as we go through this, stops calling Lucy by her name and stops calling her using the pronouns her or she, instead starts describing it as it. So it indicates, it's his change in syntax, indicates she's no longer the person they knew, and she's now become a thing. And he reminds John Seward of how Lucy had changed and the promise that he made her just before he died. And he says to Seward, trust me. And Seward does. Goes on to say that the golden crucifix that they have popped into her mouth is being removed. And Seward is touched, because he seems to think, once they discover it's a maid that has taken the crucifix, Seward is touched by what seems to be this maid's devotion to Lucy. It's like a keepsake. But of course, Van Helsing points out that she has ulterior motives, and that she is simply an opportunist. We know this because he describes her as a worthless wretch. Note the use of the alliteration, which seems to just add to the damning description of this woman. So we are reminded as we read through that all the Western money has been left to Arthur. So Arthur's done himself quite well. He, if you are looking at it in a rather pessimistic light, his father has just died. He's gained a title and his father's money, and now the Westerners have just died, and he is their sole beneficiary as well. Okay, so we have Arthur's got to return for the funeral, and he's an absolute broken mess. He doesn't know what to do. Oh, Jack, Jack, what shall I do? And see what it says, come and look at her. So up until this point, I don't think Stoker has drawn much attention to what Lucy looks like. I mean, obviously she had 3 suitors, so she must have been beautiful, but he hasn't harped on it. He hasn't kind of made constant reference to this. So she is clearly being attractive to the opposite sex, but now the constant repetition of the adjective beautiful, 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 and by so many different people definitely shows just how much more glorious she is. And the repetition of this adjective is obviously picked up later in the reports about the Blue-for lady. So Seward is clearly struck by her intense beauty in this chapter, and obviously he thought she was beautiful before. He wanted to marry her, but it's like her beauty has multiplied exponentially. And in fact, it says how beautiful she was. Every hour seemed to be enhancing her loveliness. It frightened and amazed me somewhat, and as for Arthur, he fell a trembling and finally was shaken with doubt. Jack, is she really dead? So Lucy's lifelike appearance, or almost, it's beyond lifelike, because while she was still alive, at the end of her life, she looked so sick, whereas now she is more vivid. She looks more alive than she ever did when she was alive. And the fact that Arthur turns round and asks, is she really dead, just reinforces the impression of all the men. They are all doubting that she's dead. And again, we are beginning to think, or if for the reader who hasn't cottoned on, that of course she is now going to be the Walking Dead is quite ironic. But you've again got to remember this in terms of when it was published, and as opposed to now. When this book was first published, the whole idea of the vampire and the story of Dracula was not popular. It is Stoker who made this popular. So the first people who read this would maybe not have realized the significance of the situation. They might not have realized that Lucy would walk. She would come back as the living dead. Not because the original reader would not have understood the subtext, but because this was not something that was a part of a popular genre. Whereas nowadays we all know, because books like Stoker's Dracula have made the vampire idea so very popular and so very well known. It's almost common knowledge that when you get bitten by a vampire, you are then transformed and you become a vampire yourself. So you've got to realize that we look at it now and we are not surprised by the fact that Lucy is so lifelike, by the fact that Lucy is going to come back to life. And in fact, we might find it a little frustrating, a little annoying, the constant repetition of how beautiful she is, how beautiful she is, how lifelike she is. Because we, the reader, know this is going to happen. So we kind of think, well, let's move it on. But the original Victorian audience might not have known this because it was not a popular myth at the time. So it is his constant repetition that is what is giving them or suggesting this through subtext that this is what's going to happen. So whereas we, a contemporary audience in the 21st century, we know what's going to happen, so we might find repetition tedious. The original audience might not have known because, again, it was not a popular myth. This idea of Dracula was, remember, made terribly popular by Stoker himself. So we have Van Helsing here clearly doubting that she is dead, even more so than the others. We know that he has got a greater reason for this because clearly he has had experience with this in the past. And again, the frustration comes out that he is not telling the others. And again, I think if you need to put yourself in the shoes of a reader who never hasn't had no understanding or no education in terms of the Gothic and the idea of the vampire and Count Dracula, at what point would you have realized exactly what Van Helsing is hiding? But Arthur clearly trusts and admires Van Helsing because he held out his hand and he gives Van Helsing permission to read Lucy's papers, to take control of Lucy's paperwork. That's everything from her journals to her last will and testament, and it just shows the amount of trust he has in this man. I also think, though, you need to, obviously bearing in mind these are not real characters, they are constructs, but similarly, if Stoker is trying to create realistic characters, would Arthur be in any emotional state to do otherwise? Is he really, he's not really concerned about what happens to her paperwork, he is more mourning the death of his beloved fiancée. So we realize that Van Helsing keeps watch over Lucy's coffin. He's festooned the coffin in garlic, lilies, and roses. Obviously, lilies are flowers used often at a funeral. The garlic, we know, is to ward off vampires, and the roses are probably to hide the odor of garlic. We then swap back to a different narrator, and we go to Mina Harker. She's now obviously no longer Mina Murray, she's now Mina Harker, and her journal is dated the 22nd of September. So it is dated the day after the funeral. So the funeral was on the 21st. And Mina and Jonathan are attending a funeral as well. So we've got to remember that Hawkins, Jonathan's boss, is dead, and the fact that they are also attending a funeral. So we've got 3 funerals going on here. Remember, we've got Arthur's father's funeral, Lucy's funeral, and Mr. Hawkins' funeral. So everything happening in 3s again, which not only is a cableless number, but also is the idea of the Trinity, and a subversion of the idea of the Christian Trinity. So we need to be reminded that Hawkins is dead and that he's left everything to Jonathan. And his funeral is in London. Please note that Mina is not being insensitive, but she doesn't know Lucy has died. She hasn't been back to see Lucy since she left for Budapest. So why have we got Mina here and Jonathan here? Well, they've been gradually reintegrated into the story. And among the sequence of deaths and funerals, Jonathan has this chance glimpse of Count Dracula, a much younger Count Dracula. And this, all this death and all these funerals and all this mourning, Jonathan is shocked, and it seems to shock him out of his amnesia. And again, it's the opportunity for Mina to find out exactly what is in his diary. So she describes Jonathan's reaction as soon as he sees this man. So in London, they spot there's clearly a younger bloke, and Jonathan was very pale, his eyes seemed bulging out as half in terror and half in amazement. He gazed at a tall, thin man with a beaky nose and black moustache and pointed beard. So we have Dracula, again reminded of the nose, but it's the idea that his hair is not white yet, so it's a much younger version, and this clearly confuses and upsets him because firstly he is he's seeing Dracula, which is shocking him out of his amnesia, but even worse, he's seeing Dracula as a young man, and how is that possible? So later, Mina finds out about Lucy's death, and she does so via a telegram from Van Helsing. Okay, and we've got a situation. Oh, sorry. Before we find out about that, Mina finds out about Lucy's death. I did mean to say that, of course, with Jonathan's stark terror and the fear that he experiences when noticing Dracula, and the fact that his amnesia is perhaps beginning to dissipate, Mina states, "The time is come, I fear, when I must open that parcel, and I know what is written." Now, interesting, she uses the phrase "I fear," which is very right. It's very accurate, because not only is she going to learn some things maybe about her husband that might make her a little sad. Obviously, she's too devoted to him, and nothing she can do about. There's nothing she can do about it because it's in the past. But it's also the great fear of what is to come with this frightening monster. So Mina is informed of Lucy's death via telegram from Van Helsing, and it's this that brings Van Helsing into contact with Mina. So up until now, Mina doesn't even know about Van Helsing, but now Stoker starts to draw together the parts of the narrative for the participants at this point, when now Van Helsing goes out and informs Mina. So Mina's comment is, "Poor Arthur." She's clearly very sad. She laments for Arthur. She realizes this is a terrible blow and describes it as having lost such sweetness. So clearly she is very, very sympathetic, and she's got a sympathetic nature, and she's sad. Her friend has died, and she talks about her friend, though not in terms of Lucy dying, but how Arthur has lost some sweetness, and how the living Arthur is not going to experience the Lucy she did. So although she's aware that Lucy's dead, and she's really, really sorry for it, by sympathizing with Arthur rather than focusing on Lucy, it aligns Mina with the living. So note, as we go through this, that Mina never kind of makes much comment on her friend's death, on how she died. Instead, she talks about her as poor dead Lucy, but she doesn't cast any impressions. She doesn't say Lucy was wonderful, or we're all going to miss her, or Lucy was a bit of a flirt, but we're all going to miss her. Instead, Stoker, I think, is trying to create some kind of distance between Lucy and Mina. Not only because Lucy and Mina are on opposite sides of the moral climb, Lucy obviously being frivolous and a little bit more flamboyant and maybe a little bit more promiscuous, whereas Mina, of course, is a traditional Victorian lady with elements of New Woman. But we mustn't think that she's uncaring or unsympathetic about Lucy's fate. She clearly is. She's really upset that her best friend has died. But Stoker needs to create a distance between the two, because, of course, Lucy's got to be killed, and Mina cannot get upset by this. And again, if you recall, according to Victorian, stereotypical Victorian women are very emotional, and we cannot have an extremely emotional Mina, because we need her to be objective. We need her to pull the narrative together in terms of the papers. With Edward's diary, he takes up the narrative again and describes the funeral, and how, of course, Van Helsing breaks out into fits of giggles. In fact, he laughed until he cried. And we've got the situation where Seward is also offended, because, of course, Van Helsing compares blood transfusion to the idea of marriage, and by doing this, of course, he is suggesting, therefore, that Lucy's married 4 men, saying she's married Arthur, she's married Quincy, she's married Seward, and she's married Van Helsing. And she would, of course, is going to be a little bit offended by this. Also, we just reminded that that Lucy is going to be buried in Hampstead Cemetery. So why does he laugh? Well, it's kind of it's some people have, instead of in times of extreme stress or anxiety, get the giggles instead of maybe acting as we in society would deem appropriate. It's not an attempt to be disrespectful, it's just an emotional release. So instead of crying, perhaps they laugh. Okay, so I think we've got here the fact that Van Helsing describes his laugh as king laugh shows that he's got a sense of humor all round. It's clearly a strange sense of humor, but again, it serves to remind us that this man is idiosyncratic and profound. So he's very aware that some people have this impulse that I've just described to laugh at the most inappropriate moments. And so perhaps this is his situation, but he clearly has a kind of sense of the ridiculous, because remember again, he has different knowledge. So he knows that they're all standing there mourning the death of this woman, and actually she's not dead. She is going to come back and haunt them, and they've yet to kill her. So he clearly has the sense of the ridiculous and the situation. And I think the fact that he understands how humans can have this kind of reaction to tragic comical situations, this kind of way we respond by laughing inappropriately, it makes him seem more sympathetic and friendly. I think it gives us the idea that he's not this stuck-up doctor. I certainly can empathize, because I remember going, I must have been about 12 or 13, and going to my uncle's funeral, and the last thing my uncle's funeral was amusing, but I got completely the fits of the giggles, and I thought my parents were going to kill me. So it is this kind of, it's just, some might say it's an immature way of dealing with emotion, but it is a way of dealing with emotion. Because of the seriousness of the nature of the situation, people do not seem to think it is appropriate, yet society is the one who defines the appropriate behavior. So if society decided it was appropriate to laugh at funerals, perhaps crying would be regarded as inappropriate behavior. But as we go on, so again, just a reminder that John gets upset because, of course, Van Helsing compares the blood transfusions to marriage and describes Lucy as a polyandrist and therefore Arthur as a bigamist. So a polyandrist is a woman with multiple husbands, which, of course, in this case, is what Lucy would have. She'd have 4 husbands, and Arthur would be the bigamist. Okay, so it's Arthur's sentiment in declaring the blood bond between him and Lucy as a form of marriage, and by him saying, "Oh, it's like us being married," that is what sends Van Helsing into fits of laughter. So by exploring it like this, okay, Stoker and shows us 2 things. Number 1, Lucy would be regarded as a polyandrist and Arthur the bigamist, because she's married to 4, he's married to a woman who's married to other people. But it implies that again, it's her unorthodox sexual behavior and her promiscuity. And if Arthur believes that when he gave Lucy his blood they were married, then she obviously married everybody who gave her blood. Obviously, Van Helsing is not going to tell Arthur that his wife, if he's saying, "Oh, well, because we gave blood, that really made us married." Of course, Van Helsing's not going to say, "Oh, by the way, just remember though, everybody else gave her blood." So Arthur's going to remain in ignorance of his wife's 3 other husbands, which in effect makes him a classic cuckold, because remember, cuckold is a man who's cheated upon, and is not aware of this. But again, it's just this constant suggestion that perhaps Lucy was somewhat promiscuous. Okay, and that her morals are not the same as that of our Mina. So, we end this journal entry of Seward's, and we move on to the Westminster Gazette from the 25th of September. It is now my point to remind you that Lucy died on the 20th of September. The first appearance of the Bloofer Lady is on the 22nd. She was buried on the 21st. So, if, and this is not the case, but I'm just pointing out to you that if the 20th of September had been a Friday, she would have died on the Friday, and she would have started walking, she would have been up and walking about on the Sunday. So again, we have this idea of resurrection and the subversion and perversion of the resurrection. Okay. It's this perverse reference. Lucy is regarded as the Antichrist. Okay, she died because Christ died on the Friday, rose again on the Sunday. But it's the idea that he died on day 1 and he rose on day 3, and this is the same with Lucy. So we get to look at this newspaper article which reports on the missing children and the Bloofer Lady, and it's quite interesting because these reports comment on this Bloofer Lady being a threat to children, and it also looks at how it could be a child's game. So it neatly combines how real horror is often changed and adapted to become a game of the imagination. So it's the idea of, oh, you know, if you look in the mirror and you say 3 times Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, then of course you're going to be attacked and murdered by Bloody Mary. And it's this idea that these children have heard the story and they are turning it into a game. So the Bloofer Lady is going to get you. Again, I suppose it's a bit like Ring a Ring a Rosies, which of course is a little ditty that we play and we all fall down, but it's a little ditty that is reminiscent or is associated with the Black Death and how everyone falling down meant they were dying. Okay, so it's just again a reminder that how we as human beings take real horrors and change and adapt them. It also suggests at this point that because it's the Bloofer Lady that Lucy has risen from the grave. So again, it's a reminder that she has been resurrected, and she's going after children. All the children go missing at night, and those that are found have marks on their necks. But by making her go after children, it does 2 things. Firstly, it reminds her, makes a link with her and the female vampires at Castle Dracula. But secondly, Christ was represented as the savior of children. Bring unto me the little children is actually is a quote from the Bible, because Christ always spoke about how they were innocent and how they needed to be loved and looked after. And so by saying that Lucy has taken a child, again, it is highlighting that she is the Antichrist. And by Antichrist, it doesn't have to be particular, just one. It's just somebody who is anti and does everything that is in opposition to Christ, who was sent to save the lost. So we talk about a Bloofer Lady a lot. What it is it's the beautiful lady, and Stoker is using the vernacular. Vernacular is like an accent or dialect of a typical group of people, or a typical person in a certain either social group or area, and he's doing it to mimic the speech of the children in Hampstead at the time. So he seems to be going to great lengths to depict the working class characters, because he's even writing about their accents. So instead of saying beautiful lady, it's a Bloofer Lady. Alright, so pardon my accent, but that's where it's coming from, because it does sound a little bit odd, right? All these children running around talking about the Bloofer Lady. The other thing, though, is it's an example of intertextuality, and it's a reference to Charles Dickens' story, Our Mutual Friend. And in Dickens' story, a child dies and leaves a kiss for the Blue Lady. Now, in Dickens' novel, the Blue Lady is not a female vampire. She is a beautiful lady. And why? So why has Stoker made reference to Dickens? Well, clearly his audience or his readership would have known Dickens and would have been aware of the story. It was a popular story at the time. But both of them also focus on the idea that children are innocent victims. Dickens, however, explores children's death in sentimental ways. You know, they're dying because they are in poverty, and if they've got evil parents, the evil parents are being punished. But we feel sorry for the child, and it's a gut-wrenching, tear-jerking kind of description. Stoker, on the other hand, is looking at is focusing on the horror of losing a child. His child characters are incidental. They need to be children in order for us to be shocked. But they are purely just innocent children. And the fact that they are children is incidental to the plot. It's the idea that the innocent are being killed by the Blue Lady, who, and in fact, it's so awful. The situation is so sad. But the children are also now turning into their favorite game. So, ooh, if you tell mummy, the Blue Lady will get you, or even parents maybe saying to their children, if you don't behave, I will call the Blue Lady. So I think in terms of this, we need to realize that Stoker seems to be quite careful when he represents the children as sexually innocent beings. That's what he wants to highlight. So although that the children are very aware that Lucy is beautiful, okay, they are innocent and they are physically just looking at a beautiful woman, whereas so far everything Lucy's done is associated with sexuality and deviance of vampire activity. But when Lucy attacks the children, it's not. We the reader are very well aware that it is not a sexual act. It is a game. It's not a game either. Sorry, it's a way for her to feed. Okay, and again we are reminded. So okay, she's attacking children, not because she wants to convert them, but it's the idea that young blood, and young blood brings with it youth herself, and young blood is obviously preferable for vampires because it's full of energy, it's full of the life force. So we end on a rather sad note with more children missing, and again I think you've got to bear in mind that the modern contemporary reader of the 21st century is well aware that this is Lucy roaming around killing children, whereas the Victorian reader may still be pulling things together.